Welcome, everyone, to today's second session at COVIDCon. I want to thank Ian for a wonderful first session and an introduction to the subject matter. We're going to be discussing the difference in the reaction between dictatorships and democracies around the world to the virus, what kind of steps they've each taken, and what we can draw and learn from this as we move forward. We have three extraordinary panelists here with me today. We're honored that they're taking the time to be here. I wanted to allow them each to give you an introduction. So I'll allow Joshua to go first. Joshua Wong,
Yeah,
tell us a little bit about yourself and what the reaction of the Hong Kong government has been.
yeah. So I'm Joshua Wong, activist from Hong Kong, and thank you for the invitation. And it's really my pleasure to share some of the update in Hong Kong. I think the success of Hong Kong in containing the spread of coronavirus was heavily due to distrust towards the Hong Kong government and China after the tragic epidemic outbreak, which means SARS in 2003. And as a result, Hong Kong people respond to the pandemic instantly with little hesitation. And with that said, the Hong Kong government was just like many countries around the world, refused to close the border connecting to China and failing to secure surgical masks and product for public use. But I would also like to emphasize that it was not until the civil society pressured the government did the government take any concrete action. In early February, public medical staff of Hong Kong went on strike, the labor strike, for a week, as to demand the government to shut down its border with China and to provide sufficient protective gear to doctors and nurses. According, the government shut down most of the border with China. And at the same time, due to the ongoing social movement in Hong Kong since last summer, there is strong public distrust against the Hong Kong government and China. And people hence take extra protective measures, including social distancing and wearing surgical masks, prior to the government making such public appeals. And the government, when the Hong Kong government did not provide the public with the necessary information to combat the coronavirus, they were unwilling to do something as simple as request the public to wear face masks at the early stage of the epidemic. Thankfully, Hong Kong people have learned that the Hong Kong government do not provide credible information and was fully aware that self-help is needed if they want to get through and overcome this coronavirus. So Hong Kong has stocked up on face mask supply and how hand sanitizers are offered in restaurant and on taxi for free. Company also encourage their staff to work from home since February. And the civil society has taken the initiative to adopt this prevention measure to minimize local infection and reduce community outbreak. Of the million of visitors who have come to Hong Kong since December, how many of them have unknowingly been in close contact with those who have contacted with coronavirus? And my observe is, apart from how people in the civil society highly engaged, the medical staff went on strike also put far more and more pressure to the Hong Kong government and to strengthen the immigration control and to seal off the border to prevent more people from entering Hong Kong in January and February. And the Hong Kong government when the Hong Kong government is not capable to lead Hong Kong out to overcome this coronavirus, but it's still lucky that 7 million Hong Kongers are aware how the situation might be more worse and how they can stand in solidarity and combat this pandemic together. And I think with such brief sharing, I would say that how even Bloomberg described Hong Kong as a failed state with such a government is not willing to governance Hong Kong and to handle the crisis. But with the strong civil society without the trust to China and Beijing, it just caught Hong Kong even under the outbreak of virus. The situation is still far more better than our imagination. So I think two critical elements that need to be emphasized. The first is whether the country is democratic or not it will of course affect their policy and their way out to handle the virus outbreak. At the same time, whether the government and the civil society are enough sensitive on Beijing or not, which is really critical. And just like the successful case in Taiwan, and it just already showed a model that where the country really have the trust on Beijing or not will really affect their preparation in the early stage to confront such virus. And here's my brief sharing.
Thank you, Joshua. So essentially, we've all been very impressed by how Hong Kong as a society has reacted to the virus. The death totals are shockingly low, just a handful. But as Joshua was saying, perhaps the reason for that is not necessarily heavy-handed orders and decrees from the government, from Carrie Lam's government, but perhaps a decentralized, inspired response from the citizenry. So, Bethany, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing, what you've seen, and how you would answer this question of, essentially who's responding better, to open societies or closed societies around the world?
Sure. So just a little bit about myself. My name is Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, and I am the China reporter at Axios, where I cover China and also with an emphasis on China's impact in the United States and the rest of the world. So today I'm going to be talking about the work that I have done looking at how governments across Europe and also in Venezuela have addressed the coronavirus response. So I want to talk about a couple of trends we're seeing worldwide as authoritarian governments are responding to the coronavirus. And I'll go through two main trends here. And the theme here is that the coronavirus could potentially strengthen authoritarian regimes or pull borderline governments or those with some authoritarian tendencies closer to authoritarianism. So the first point is that authoritarian governments or those that lean authoritarian are tending to support each other and group together as they're addressing the crisis. This is for several reasons. Several of these countries have a history of corruption and a lack of transparency that has broken trust in the international community and left them relatively isolated. This means it's difficult for the international community to send aid because of sanctions, because of a lack of diplomatic relations, and because of a lack of trust, especially in terms of sending actual money. Weaker regimes are looking to stronger authoritarian regimes for assistance. So, for example, Venezuela is looking to China and Russia for assistance with the coronavirus. And this is strengthening the ties between authoritarian governments. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that this is creating a bloc. Let me give an example, a case study of Venezuela. So Maduro is currently in power in Caracas because of a rigged election, and his government has limited diplomatic relations and has membership in relatively few international organizations, also subject to heavy sanctions. The opposition government in exile under Juan Guaido has wider diplomatic recognition, but is also not in power. They are a government in exile. That means that it is difficult for Venezuela to get international assistance. The International Monetary Fund rejected Maduro's request for $5 billion to deal with the crisis on the basis that he lacks international recognition. Organizations and nations are reluctant to send aid to Venezuela because they fear that it will just disappear, that there's no accountability, that there's so much corruption. So here is something that Manuel Avendaño, who is the director of international relations for the Juan Guaido government, this is what he told me in an interview. He said, if we don't have clear accountability and transparency to know where the money goes, we can't accept that the regime administrates this money. So because it's not able to get support from the established international community, Venezuela is leaning heavily on support from China, Russia, and Cuba. So that's the first point. My second point here is that the coronavirus is further entrenching authoritarian elements within non-authoritarian governments. For example, there is widespread health surveillance that is now completely acceptable in countries where previously it would not have been. Digital surveillance, cell phone tracking, etc. And the technology usage and social acceptance of this kind of surveillance will very likely outlast the coronavirus. In the United States, President Trump has used the nation's complete preoccupation with the coronavirus to fire 7 inspectors general, which is it's a purge that would otherwise be extraordinarily controversial, but there's just no energy here, and there's no free mental space for civil society to rise up to address that. In Europe, Chinese propaganda and mask diplomacy is providing fodder for Eurosceptic and populist politicians who are eager to hail China and to criticize the EU's response to COVID-19. So EU leaders may now have to worry about both Chinese and Russian overtures that weaken European unity. Hungary is by far the worst example of this. So at the end of March, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has spent years hollowing out Hungarian democracy, effectively killed what remained of that country's democratic institutions in a huge power grab, essentially creating the EU's first dictatorship. He suspended parliament indefinitely and got the government to pass a law that would put a 5-year prison sentence on people for spreading false information, ostensibly about the coronavirus, but it's very broadly defined. It could mean anything. And Orban has rejected assistance from the EU and has turned to China and Russia for help. So with that, I will leave it there and leave it to William.
Thank you, Bethany. I think as we discuss the differences between dictatorships and democracies, it's important to think about both their reactions kind of before a public health disaster and also after. Before, you have this idea of the cover-up, which Ian described, and censorship, and a lack of a free flow of information, which is sort of like the Chernobyl effect, if folks remember from the 1980s historic disaster in the Soviet Union. The Communist Party first tried to, essentially triggered the explosion at Chernobyl because they put loyalty to the party over the public health and the public good. And then later they tried to cover up the explosion through censorship. So this is happening in many, many, many countries around the world, as Bethany and others will talk to you about through COVIDCon. But the second thing is that governments are also using and exploiting the opportunity and the sort of the boogeyman of the virus, which is real, but they're using it as an sort of an excuse to grab more power. So these are both things we have to kind of look at. So William, tell us more about what you've seen in East Asia, and talk to us a little bit about Taiwan's response and how extraordinary it's been, if not perfect, but still something for us to be inspired by.
Right. So, hi, my name is William, and I'm the East Asia correspondent for Germany's Deutsche Welle. I have been mainly covering the coronavirus outbreak since the start in China, and then how Taiwan has been responding to it, and the global reaction to actually these two countries' response and handling of the coronavirus outbreak. I think the one key thing that really defines the differences between China and Taiwan is the word transparency, and how transparency really helped the governments to either gain the civil society's trust and compliance, versus how the civil society, because of the lack of transparency, the government will have to use super heavy-handed ways to force civil society into complying with certain rules for a very extended period of time. For example, in China, in the beginning, we all know how the government in the beginning tried to hide up and conceal some of the early efforts of the local medical community in Wuhan to really inform the world and the government about the emergence of these coronavirus cases. And that really led to Wuhan having to really adopt and implement the draconian measure that we saw that lasted 76 days, where citizens basically have all their rights being stripped away from them and having to live in an unprecedented lifestyle for an extended period of time. And that created so many problems, including the distrust in the local community in the government's ability to handle this crisis. And at the same time, the authenticity of the information that the government share with the civil society will always be viewed with a high level of suspicion, even after the lockdown has been ended just last week. Well, whereas in Taiwan, the government also took a very early initiative to respond to the rise of the coronavirus outbreak. And one of the key reasons is because of Taiwan's experience in fighting against the SARS epidemic in 2002 and 2003. That experience really led to the key decision-making and decisive strategies that the Taiwanese government has implemented, including the early intervention that they adopted by boarding onto planes that were flying into Taiwan from Wuhan to check all the incoming passengers. And Taiwan also became one of the first countries that decided to close off its border to the visitors coming from China, Hong Kong, and Macau, because it wants to be able to stay ahead of the curve of the outbreak. And that's one of the reasons why until now, Taiwan still has less than 400 cases and only 6 deaths. And, we have to remember that Taiwan and China have a very, very busy interaction on a daily basis. There are at least 500,000 Taiwanese people working in China. And when the coronavirus outbreak first started in China, that was also the period of time where hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese people are returning from China to Taiwan for the Lunar New Year holiday. So the government's intervention and also the transparency that when they roll out new measures that are supposedly going to have to ask these citizens to compromise some of their personal lives and personal rights, they use a very transparent way to explain the intention behind all these measures. And, the boundaries are also being laid out very clearly through a daily press briefing that Taiwan has been doing for the last more than 60 days. And through these daily press briefings, the civil society have been very receptive and also cooperative towards the government's measures. And this has created a very consistent basically response from, both from the government side and also from the civil society side, that created a very interesting dynamic that when the government rolled out a new rule, the civil society will start to implement it, and then they will also, in a way, I don't want to use the word policing, but everyone will be reminding each other that, you need to remember to follow these rules because this is to make sure that we can continue to keep our lives as normal as possible. So with that being said, Taiwan is one of the countries that still have their schools open, running, and most of the companies are still working from the office. And interestingly, it still has the only baseball league that is currently still ongoing around the world, whereas in the United States, major baseball league will have, unfortunately have to suspend by now. So I think these are just the key, I think, is transparency and how the government will be able to win the trust of the civil society, even when they have to roll out some unprecedented measures that will have to compromise somehow the citizens' lifestyle in some ways.
So as William is pointing out, Taiwan is proof and evidence that we don't necessarily need a police state to fight the virus. A free and open society can tackle it in an admirable way and arguably in a world-class way. Now, I have just a short image to show you all, and it's a little bit of data. All right, so this is a chart that I wanted to show you all just to give us a very brief insight into the deaths per million statistic, which I think is something that's important to think about. So what you can see here is that obviously Taiwan and Singapore perform very well. California, the largest state in the United States, also seems to be performing quite well relative to Hubei province in China, as well as Iran and Italy, which are all doing quite poorly. So dictatorships and democracies, in context with their competency, can react to this thing in a variety of ways. But what's important to see here is that most people, when they are in a dictatorship in today's world, numerically, they're not going to be in Singapore. That's highly unlikely. Singapore is a very unique place. More likely, if you live in an authoritarian state, you're in a place like Egypt or Russia or China, or perhaps Zimbabwe or Iran, etc. So if we actually look at the numbers from these dictatorships, the ones that they give us, this data is from the governments themselves. It tells a story that seems to be competitive with democracies. But if we actually look at the numbers from dissident groups inside China and Iran, it tells a slightly different story. Now, these numbers are from opposition groups, right? So opposition groups in Iran tell us that 26,000 people have died. We have no way of knowing whether that's accurate. However, what we do know is that the 3,000 number that the Iranian government has given out is certainly not accurate. Is the truth somewhere in the middle? Perhaps. In Hubei province, the government says that just over 3,000 people have died. Is that accurate? Certainly not. But we don't know where the truth is. Some opposition groups on the ground have told us that as many as 40,000 people have died. Is that accurate? We don't know. But basically, the point is that if you actually see the truth inside these dictatorships, the rosy pictures they're telling the international community probably aren't so rosy. So I'd like to open that up to the panelists here. As far as this issue of, how can we even trust the numbers coming out of governments? And to give you one last example, in North Korea today, the North Korean government is reporting 0 cases, which we know to be absurd, given that its location. So maybe Bethany, maybe you want to weigh on this idea of how can we trust numbers coming out of different governments?
Well, I think it's really important to look at which government it is, and to look at the history of the data and statistics that they put forward to the world. In the case of China, initially, so after they stopped their cover-up and became far more transparent about what was happening and about their response, there seemed to be a period of time, a few weeks, where their numbers, seemed to track with what reality, could be. But that seemed to stop after they passed around 80,000. And if you look
after
at
about
charts,
February 15, right? It's like
that's right.
there.
That's right, exactly. So if you look at like a graph, especially if you sort of look at the shape of China's curve compared to other countries, something really starts looking really wrong after February 15th. And I think in the months to come, we will have greater clarity as to what exactly happened and why. But it could be, for example, and this is why it's important to look at on a country by country basis. So in China, there's a Leninist system, a one-party state where there's a sort of a centralized hierarchy of power, and local officials look upwards for their legitimacy. They're not elected by the people, and so they're trying to make themselves look good. I think after February 15th, they came under a lot of pressure around the country to make it appear as though their cases were going down, or they weren't getting new cases. This is one possibility. So an important question to ask about China's case, and maybe we'll know in the future, is the data that the Chinese government, their central government, putting forward, is that the best data they have, and the problem is on the local levels? Or is there a second list that's more accurate that they're keeping to themselves? And these are important questions when we're talking about how to evaluate it on a country by country basis. If you look at Venezuela, now they have a looming problem. They don't yet have a high number of cases, but they're not very functional. They're an authoritarian state, but they're not very functional. And so, unlike China, I think it's unlikely that they would have the ability to, have a widespread, highly controlled suppression of information. Rather, they're just never going to have the testing. They're just never going to be able to get their numbers up there.
So, Joshua, do you think that the undercounting in China is a good faith? It's the best we can do, or do you think there's malicious intent there, where the Communist Party is trying to tell a different story than reality?
No doubt at all how the Communist Party in China tried to provide another kind of misleading propaganda or kind of fake news widespread around the world. Especially, I think how they have the closer ties to cooperate with the WHO, and how the Director General of WHO just served the interest of Beijing and override the national pride by ignoring the global health crisis. I think is what we experience and realize. Especially one point I would like to emphasize is I remember around early February, lots of countries have been misled by the CCP false reporting, and how the WHO hesitate to announce the coronavirus as a pandemic. And I think that's the critical issue to cause the pandemic to being widespread around the world, and why we need to conduct this conference by web conference is also related to the fault of CCP.
William, you've done a lot of work exposing human rights violations in the northwest part of China with religious minorities, and this is something that the Chinese government continues to deny outright. I mean, they say that there aren't any prison camps, even though we can see them from outer space. So how do you take, as a journalist, on the one hand, your knowledge that there are massive lies that this nation state continues to propagate, and on the other hand, the only data we have is the data they give us? You know, what does a responsible media outlet do? Does the responsible media outlet share the numbers from Beijing? Does the responsible media outlet share the numbers with perhaps a caveat? I mean, how as a journalist would you hope to unpack this for people?
So I think one thing very important is going back to first Bethany's point is that I think past track record of each government is so important for us to assess the authenticity and the trustworthiness of their numbers. And in the case of China, it's very important for us to because the reality is that the number that the government officials release are the only set of number that we can count on to start with. So it is important to share those numbers, but at the same time, whenever these numbers are being shared, it should, there should always be additional information for reminding the general public about, what happened before, and, what are some of the information that have been raised by interviews that we have done with local civil society in Wuhan and also in Hubei province, where these are the individuals that are being impacted the most, and there have been the most widespread rumors and information about how cremation centers, for example, there are in the beginning of the outbreak, there are so many cases of death that were never diagnosed properly, and they were never counted into the official death, and also a lot of the citizens were sent home even though they're already showing symptoms, because the local healthcare system is really collapsing. And what that caused is just that, it's very important for journalists to, at the same time releasing and showing the official data, but at the same time trying their best to connect with the local civil society, because in the face of an unprecedented crisis like this that is impacting, changing everyone's lives in a very fundamental way, that is when the local civil society will have an awakening moment, like what the civil society in Wuhan and Hubei had. And so many of my interviews in the past have really told me, even after the lockdown was lifted, that they will never be able to trust the government as they were before, because of the experience that they had over the last 76 days.
Well, from a human rights perspective, it seems just irresponsible for mainstream media outlets ranging from the Times to the Financial Times to be just regurgitating the data from Beijing without any caveats at all. I mean, perhaps they could use an asterisk. Perhaps they could tell their readers, hey, this is the number we have from the government, but perhaps we shouldn't trust this. Otherwise, it just makes the Chinese government look fantastic. So there is some more due diligence that can be done there. Questions from the audience. So we have not a lot of time. We're gonna focus on two main ones that I've seen here. So first of all, William, we're going to talk about surveillance and technology quickly, and then Joshua, we're going to talk about Animal Crossing. So William, even in Taiwan and South Korea, even in democracies, you are seeing governments use phone tracking and other sort of violations of individual privacy. Do you feel like this is effective? Do we need this? Have you seen actual evidence that it works? Or do you think this is something that just brings us down a slippery slope to what's happening in China, where citizens are being color-coded, green, yellow, or red, and that dictates what they can do?
I think in the case of South Korea and Taiwan, these mechanisms are being proven to be effective in a way in the very beginning, because the government of both places, they stayed ahead of the curve. So that is why they were able to use this surveillance technology and also methods to track down all these possible people contracting or carrying the virus. But once, and set the boundaries very clearly so that there will not be pushbacks from the civil society. But at the same time, in Taiwan, for example, the government is using the name of communicable disease like this to pass a lot of the laws that in a way is giving the government a lot more power than usual. So I think it is in the conscience of the government and the president and the administration itself to balance that, walk that very fine line of making sure that they are always passing these in the sense that it is purely for controlling and preventing the disease from spreading rather than, giving its administration more power for longer term. So I think the government just needs to keep that in mind while they're using these methods to fight. Yeah.
Let's be very careful. I mean, look, there's no independent scientific studies that have proven that digital contact tracing or phone surveillance have been the difference maker, as opposed to things like hand washing, masks, social distancing, public education, etc. So let's just be very careful. I mean, again, or else we're going to start to head in a direction where the public is normalized and, basically okay with mass surveillance. So there's something that needs to be done here to as journalists and activists, where we need to help challenge these claims by governments that this stuff is necessary. Let's actually see the effectiveness. Singapore, which is a surveillance state, is heading in the wrong direction. And of course, Joshua, in China, in the world's largest surveillance state, which has the most sophisticated surveillance in the history of humankind, they couldn't stop the virus, and it's brought tremendous economic destruction to the government. So that should teach us a thing or two about mass surveillance and its effectiveness. So just to close, we couldn't do this panel, Joshua, without you telling us a little bit about Animal Crossing, given that your protest in this Nintendo video game has taken the world by storm. Tell us just very briefly what happened and why you are using this video game as a tool for awareness to help promote freedom in Hong Kong.
Animal Crossing is the game that allow players to freely decorate the island, and lots of Hong Kongers just transformed their island to be a protest site. And with those slogans just like 5 demands, no one less, and free Hong Kong. And with the political censorship in China, Beijing just decided to ban this game. And because of some of the players in Hong Kong use this game as one of the platform to gather user and to show some of the political demand. Which is really ironic, is no one could imagine such Animal Crossing game just building your island, and it's the game that no matter from kindergarten to high school or elderly, everyone in different age group, they will play this game, but it's still being censored out by China. And I think this issue also caused lots of attention around the world, no matter Reuters or a lot of the international media report it. And I wonder in the upcoming future, once I decided to play any games and promote on Twitter, that game might ban in China. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're just going to wrap up here, but it's amazing that the government that many people in the West are saying, hey, we should follow more closely. Let's remember, this government is censoring video games, is censoring creativity, is preventing people from collaborating with each other, is locking up millions of people in prison camps, is orchestrating the world's largest surveillance state. We should be very careful about these heeds and suggestions to be more like the Chinese Communist Party. And remember, if you can take anything from this session, think about Taiwan, think about all these democracies around the world that have handled the virus, like New Zealand, like Iceland, like so many others, that haven't had to go to heavy-handed measures, that haven't stripped freedom from their people, that have done so in a way that is open and transparent. We don't need a police state to fight the virus, would be the conclusion. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you.
And we look forward to the rest of COVIDCon.